Diesel fumes and wet gravel have a specific smell. Most people don't know that. They walk past construction sites or parking lots after rain and they just think outside. But once you've spent 14 months breathing that combination through a respirator in the Kandahar Valley, your brain files it differently. It stops being background noise. It becomes a trigger. Wren Hadley had learned to manage her triggers the same way she managed everything else, quietly, efficiently, and without telling anyone. She worked the night shift at Northgate General in Sudbury, Ontario, which suited her perfectly. The night shift ran on a skeleton crew and low expectations. Nobody wanted to make small talk at 3 in the morning. Nobody wanted to know your backstory. You showed up, you did the work, you went home. That was the entire social contract. And Wren had signed it gratefully 6 years ago when she'd moved back from Vancouver with 2 duffel bags and a medical discharge she didn't want to explain. The ward she worked was medical overflow, the unglamorous anteroom of the hospital where patients waited to be sorted somewhere more important. Sprained joints, chest infections, elderly patients in from long-term care facilities because someone finally noticed they'd stopped eating. Nothing that required the kind of fast, ugly decision-making that Wren had once been very good at. That was fine. She didn't need to be good at that anymore. Her colleagues knew almost nothing about her. She was Hadley, last name only, because she'd introduced herself that way on day 1, and it had stuck. She was 34, though she looked older. She kept her dark hair in a tight braid, wore scrubs in colors so washed out they'd ceased to have a name, and drank her coffee black from a dented stainless steel thermos she'd been carrying since her 2nd deployment. She was competent in the way a well-maintained piece of equipment is competent. Reliable, efficient, and not particularly warm to the touch. The other nurses had given up trying to befriend her around month 3. Not unkindly, she just didn't give them anything to work with. She'd answer direct questions. She'd cover shifts without being asked. She'd never once complained about anything, but she ate her lunch alone by the stairwell exit, and she never showed up to birthday celebrations in the break room. And whenever anyone asked where she was from originally, she said here and there in a voice that closed the door on the conversation so gently they didn't even hear it click shut. Dr. Mehta, the overnight attending on Tuesdays, had once told her she was the most efficient nurse he'd ever worked with, and that it unnerved him slightly. She'd thanked him and walked away before he could decide if it was a joke. It was a Thursday in late February when everything she'd built came apart. The shift had been mild. A retired schoolteacher in bed 7 with a pulmonary embolism, stable, monitored, waiting for the morning team. A teenage boy with a badly managed asthma attack, his mother pale and vibrating with the specific terror of parents who'd nearly lost a child before. Wren had spoken to the mother in the low, flat tones she used for frightened civilians. Steady, factual, the boy's oxygen was good. His numbers were climbing. He was fine. She was restocking the medication cart in the hallway when she heard them. She heard them before she saw them. It wasn't the sound that hit her first, exactly. It was the pattern. Most people moving through a hospital have an unconscious shuffle to them. They're disoriented. They're searching for signs. They're worried about something. They move in the irregular, distracted way of people whose minds are somewhere else. These footsteps were different. 4 sets of them, coming from the direction of the main entrance, and they were moving in a deliberate rhythm, spread apart the right distance. A practiced, ingrained distance that isn't something you learn and then forget. Wren's hands went still on the medication cart. She turned her head a fraction, not her whole body, just enough to see down the length of the corridor. And she looked at them. 4 people, 3 men and 1 woman, all of them somewhere in their 30s, civilian clothes, heavy winter jackets, worn boots, the kind of dark practical layers you pick when you're dressing for utility and not for appearance. But the clothes hung on them wrong, too deliberately plain, the same way Wren's own clothes were deliberately plain. Their heads were moving. Each of them was doing the same low automatic scan of the space. Corners, exit points, the security desk where Ormond, the overnight guard, was very much asleep with his chin tipped toward his chest. They assessed him in under 2 seconds and moved on. Wren's chest went tight. She turned back to the medication cart and carefully placed both hands flat on the metal surface and breathed, slow and controlled, through her nose. She tasted something metallic at the back of her throat that had nothing to do with the hospital. They aren't here for you. She hadn't heard from anyone in 5 years. She was a ghost. She had been exceptionally careful about being a ghost. Her address was registered to a P.O. box in Chelmsford. She didn't use social media. She paid cash for things when she could, and when she couldn't, she didn't think about it. They are not here for you. She heard them stop at the nursing station. "Excuse me." It was the woman's voice, clipped and polite with a slight maritime flatness to the vowels. "We're looking for a nurse who works this ward." Her name is Wren Hadley. Wren heard Kyle, the junior nurse working the overnight desk, pause mid-keyboard click. "Is she a patient?" Kyle asked. "No," said one of the men. She works here, night shift. Is she on tonight?" "I'd need to know if your family or—" "We know her," the woman said. Her voice had shifted, still controlled, but something underneath it had changed texture. "We served with her. We just need to know if she's here." The medication cart made a small metallic sound as Wren's hand tightened on its edge. Served with her, she knew, in the analytical part of her brain that was always observing, always cataloging, that she had about 30 seconds before Kyle looked around the ward and spotted her. Kyle was 26 and still operated under the belief that connecting people was an inherently good thing to do. She could go out the stairwell exit. She had done it before, during a stretch of bad weeks, when the February light had contracted to almost nothing and the nights had started bleeding together. And she'd needed air with some urgency. She knew exactly how far the push bar depressed before the alarm triggered, and she knew how to hold it just short of the contact point and slip through the gap. She didn't move. She wasn't entirely sure why. Kyle's voice drifted down the corridor. "Hadley, there are some people here asking for you." The 4 of them turned as a unit. Wren still had her back to them. She heard them begin walking toward her, and she exhaled slowly through her nose, and she turned around. Up close, they were worse, not in any threatening way. Worse in the specific way of people who carry the evidence of things on their bodies that cannot be undone. The woman, dark-skinned, close-cropped hair, jaw like carved granite, had a deep orbital scar above her left eye that had healed poorly, puckered and silvered. The man to her right walked with a slight stiffness in his right shoulder, the kind that meant the joint had been reconstructed. The second man was young-looking, maybe 31 or 32, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to go quiet as a survival mechanism. The fourth, older, mid-40s, a weathered Anglo face with deep-set gray eyes, was looking at Wren in a way that made her want to take a step backward. He looked relieved. She had not expected that. Hadley. He said it the way her name had been said on the radio, back when her name on the radio had meant someone needed her to run toward something instead of away from it. "Carver," she said. Her voice came out flat and even. She was proud of that. For a moment, nobody said anything. The fluorescent light above the nursing station buzzed quietly. Somewhere down the hall, the older man in bed 3 shifted and coughed. "You're a hard person to find," Carver said. "I know." Wren put the medication she'd been holding back onto the cart. Her movements were careful and precise. "How did you?" "Regimental records," said the woman with the orbital scar. "The address they had was a P.O. box, but your RN registration has a province. We narrowed it." Wren absorbed this. She looked at the woman. "Kowalski," she said. Kowalski's jaw tightened slightly. "You remember, your eye healed, mostly." Kowalski touched the scar briefly, reflexively, and then dropped her hand. "Nerve damage on that side, but I've got the eye." Wren looked at the man with the reconstructed shoulder. She didn't say his name right away. She wasn't sure she was ready to say it. "Devlin," he said, reading her. "Your shoulder. 2 surgeries, physio for about 1.5 years. He moved it slightly, a small demonstrating shrug, winced just a fraction. "Range of motion is about 70%. Better than nothing." The young one, the still, quiet one, said nothing. He was watching her with dark eyes that were trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Huang," she said to him. He nodded once. She turned back to Carver. He was the one who'd found her. He was the one who'd always been the one, the team lead. The person whose job it had been to make decisions about direction and movement and timing, and whose decisions she'd spent 14 months executing with minimal comment and maximum efficiency. She'd respected him. She still respected him. She just hadn't wanted to see him again. "What do you want, Carver?" she asked. The ER behind her was conducting its quiet mid-shift murmur. Kyle had the grace to look suddenly very interested in something on his computer. Dr. Mehta had emerged briefly from a patient room, taken one look at the 4 people standing in the corridor with Wren, and retreated back through the door with the particular tactical awareness of a man who understood he had walked into a situation that did not belong to him. Carver reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Wren's right hand didn't move toward anything. She was standing in a hospital in Sudbury, Ontario. She was unarmed. She was 34 years old and wearing size-large scrubs over a frame they swam on, and there was nothing threatening in this corridor. But her hand still wanted to move, and the wanting of it was exhausting in the way it was always exhausting, the way it had been for 6 years. The constant overhead cost of being someone whose body had been trained to respond before her mind caught up. He pulled out a photograph. It was small, worn at the edges, the glossy surface cracked from having been folded and unfolded many times. He held it out to her. She didn't take it. She looked at it. It was a field hospital, the interior of a forward operating position in Helmand, the fabric walls of the medical bay visible in the background. There were 5 people in it. Kowalski, younger looking, her orbital ridge intact. Devlin with both shoulders even. Huang, barely 23, holding something up at the camera with an expression of uncomplicated glee that Wren had almost forgotten he was capable of. Carver in the background, talking into a radio, and Wren. Standing to the left, arms crossed over her chest kit, head turned 3/4 away from the camera, as though she'd only just noticed it was there. Her hair was shorter. Her face was different, not younger exactly, just less defended, less sealed. She looked at herself for a long moment. "Where did you get that?" she said. "Huang had it," Carver said. "He kept it." Wren looked at Huang. He met her eyes, and for a second his careful composure cracked slightly at the seams. "Seemed important to," he said. His voice was quiet, with a slight Calgary accent she'd forgotten he had. At the time. At the time. Wren looked away from him, toward the window at the far end of the corridor. Outside, the Sudbury winter was doing what it did, pressing against the glass, gray and total. The parking lot lights made yellow smears in the wet snow. "You need to tell me why you're here," she said. Her voice was still level, but it cost her more now. "It's the middle of my shift, and if this is about a debrief or a statement, or the medical discharge is finalized, there's nothing left to." "It's not about that," Kowalski said. "Then what?" Silence for a moment. Carver and Kowalski exchanged a brief glance, the kind of glance that meant someone had been designated to speak and was collecting themselves to do it. It was Devlin who spoke. "Garrity died," he said, 8 weeks ago." The name landed differently than Wren had expected. Not with shock. She'd known, in the way you know things about people you've tried to stop thinking about, that Garrity's odds weren't favorable. He'd been evac'd with a traumatic brain injury 6 weeks before the end of their rotation. He'd been conscious but changed, profoundly changed. She'd heard through a second-hand source years later that he was living with his parents in Prince George. But knowing a thing is possible and hearing it confirmed are different mechanisms, and her chest did something involuntary and unpleasant. "His family held the service last month," Kowalski said. Her voice was careful. "We were all there, and afterward we started talking." She paused. "About what actually happened, the whole of it, not the version in the report." Wren looked at her. "We talked about the bridge," Devlin said quietly, "and there it was. The bridge in Zari district that didn't appear on any of the maps they'd been issued. The one they'd been crossing at night on the last extraction run, when the vehicle 2 ahead of theirs had gone up on an IED, and the order had come through immediately to fall back. All units, fall back to the firebase, and in the burning light of the vehicle Wren had been able to see that there were 2 people still alive in the wreckage. One of them was Garrity. The other was a combat engineer named Fassbender, whose name she'd known for 4 months, and whose face she'd seen every morning at mess, and who was 26 years old. The order had been fall back. She hadn't. She'd gone in with Devlin covering her, because Devlin hadn't fallen back either, and they'd gotten both of them out. Fassbender had lost 3 fingers on his right hand and had bilateral eardrum damage. Garrity had been breathing when she'd hauled him out of the burning frame of the vehicle, and he'd still been breathing when AVAC had arrived. He'd been breathing for 7 more years. She had never talked about the bridge with anyone. Garrity's mother, Carver said, and his voice was rough now in a way it hadn't been before, wanted to know. At the service. She wanted to know exactly what happened, and nobody had the complete version, because it got written up the clean way and the people who knew didn't talk about it. He stopped. He swallowed. "So we told her, and then we decided we needed to find you." Wren realized she was gripping the medication card again. She released it deliberately. She looked at her own hands, the slight callus on her right palm, the small white scar at the base of her index finger from a piece of windshield glass in a Land Rover in 2014. "I didn't save him," she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. "You understand that. He came home, and he was. Garrity wasn't. What he was before wasn't what he came home as. I kept him alive, and I brought him home, and he spent 7 years trying to live inside a brain that had been fundamentally altered, and his mother lost her son twice. First when he came back wrong, and then when he died. She stopped. The words were scraping against something raw on their way out. So don't come here and tell me it was the right call. I don't know if it was the right call. I've spent 6 years not knowing. None of them argued with her. That was not the response she'd expected, and it destabilized her slightly. We know, Huang said. He was looking at the floor, his jaw working quietly. We've thought about that too. All of us have. Whether staying, whether going in, whether it was worth. He stopped. He started again. Fassbender has a daughter. She's 4. Her name is Elise. He looked up. He sent a letter, through Carver. For you. Carver reached back into his jacket pocket and produced an envelope. Standard white, the kind from any corner store. It had been sealed, and then the seal had been reinforced with a strip of clear tape. The way you sealed something you were worried might come open in transit. Wren looked at it for a long time. He named her Elise, she said. After his grandmother, Carver said, but he wanted you to know about her. Wren reached out and took the envelope. The paper was soft from handling. Fassbender had held it for a while before giving it to Carver, or Carver had held it for a while before tonight, or both. She didn't open it. She ran her thumb across the edge of it once and then held it at her side. Garrity's mother, she said, after a moment. What's her name? Shirley, Devlin said. Shirley Garrity. She's in Prince George. Is she? How is she? Kowalski's mouth compressed briefly. She's the way you'd imagine, but she wanted. She asked us specifically, when we found you, to tell you that she knows what you did and that she doesn't hold it against you. Kowalski paused. She said she wanted you to hear that, in those words. The medical ward was very quiet. Kyle had stopped pretending to type. Down the hall, the school teacher, in bed 7, had her call light off, and the monitor was reading steady. The world was paused, holding itself still with an effort. And Wren was standing in the middle of it with an envelope she didn't know how to hold, and a chest full of something she'd spent 6 years compressing into the smallest possible shape. Why now? She said. She hated how much she sounded like she needed the answer. Because we're done waiting, Kowalski said simply. We're all done. She gestured between herself and the 3 men, a small encompassing movement. Therapy, medication, whatever, we've all been doing the work, and the work gets you to a point where you can start putting things down. But you can't put something down properly if you don't know where it belongs. She looked at Wren directly. You belonged in this, and you weren't here for any of it. I left, Wren said. You were allowed to leave, Carver said. Not unkindly. We're not saying you weren't. We're just saying we wanted you back in the loop. Not to relitigate any of it, just. He stopped. He looked around the corridor, at the pale walls and the institutional light and the equipment cart and the entirely ordinary medical ward that Wren had been hiding in. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't completely read. We wanted you to know that it mattered. What you did, the bridge and the valley and all of it, that it had consequences that went forward, not just the ones that went backward. Wren looked at the photograph still in his hand. She looked at herself in it. The version of herself that was 4 days away from the bridge, from Garrity, from the decision that had bent everything. She looked young and sealed and already very far away from any room she was physically standing in. Can I have that? She said. Carver held it out to her without a word. She took it. She held both things, the envelope and the photograph, and she looked at them, and she didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. I need to finish my shift, she said finally. Carver nodded once. No argument, no ceremony. He understood logistics. Kowalski reached out and put her hand briefly on Wren's forearm, just for a second. Then she stepped back. Devlin gave a short, businesslike nod that meant about 14 things at once, and none of them required verbalizing. Huang looked at her for a moment longer than the others, with those dark eyes that were still trying to be neutral and still not quite getting there. "The letter has Fassbender's number in it," he said. "If you want to call, no pressure." He wanted the option to be there. "Okay," Wren said. They turned and walked back up the corridor the way they'd come. The same measured rhythm, the same instinctive spread. She watched them pass the nursing station, where Kyle was making himself very small and very focused on his screen. She watched them move through the set of double doors at the end of the corridor. The doors swung shut behind them with a slow, pneumatic hiss. Kyle looked at her. She looked at him. "If you have questions," she said, "I'd appreciate it if you didn't." He nodded immediately, with the focused cooperation of someone who had correctly read the room. She tucked the photograph into her breast pocket and carried the envelope with her to the stairwell exit. She didn't go through it. She just stood near the door, where there was a cold draft coming through the frame, carrying the smell of the February night. Exhaust and wet concrete, and the specific bite of northern Ontario in winter. She opened the envelope there, in the draft, in the pale light from the overhead fixture that needed a new bulb. Fassbender's handwriting was cramped and slightly uneven from the hand that was missing 3 fingers, but it was legible. It was 2 pages. She read both of them standing up, slowly, in the way she did things when she wanted to be sure she wasn't missing anything. On the second page, near the bottom, he had written, "I don't know if you know how to let yourself off the hook for things. I'm still learning. But Elise exists because you were on that bridge, and that's a fact that doesn't depend on how you feel about anything. Facts don't need your permission. I thought maybe you should have that one." Wren folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in her pocket next to the photograph. She stood there for another minute. The draft came through the doorframe in slow, cold pulses. The light hummed above her. Somewhere in the ward, a monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. She'd told herself when she came to Northgate that the point of the night shift was invisibility. The whole architecture of her life here was built around being unseen. Eat alone. Don't explain. Don't accumulate people who would eventually ask you things you couldn't answer. She'd been good at it. She'd been very good at it. But Fassbender had a daughter named Elise, and Shirley Garrity in Prince George knew her name and didn't blame her. And Huang had kept a photograph for 6 years because it seemed important to, and none of those things had stopped being true just because she hadn't been present for any of them. She straightened up. She tucked her thermos under her arm, rolled her shoulders back until her spine was correctly aligned, and walked back up the corridor toward the medication cart she'd abandoned. Kyle was watching her approach with the careful expression of someone who is trying to look like they haven't been watching. "Bed 7's call light was on a few minutes ago," he said, neutral and professional. "I'll check on her," Wren said. She pushed the medication cart back into position, checked the lock on the wheels, and walked down the corridor to bed 7. The school teacher, Mrs. Alcott, 71, Espanola, was awake with the slightly disoriented air of people who've woken in hospitals in the middle of the night and needed a moment to place themselves. "Sorry to bother," Mrs. Alcott said. "You're not," Wren said. She checked the monitors. She checked the IV line. She adjusted the pillow behind the woman's head with a practiced, efficient movement, and then she stood still for a moment, which was something she didn't usually do. "Is everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Alcott asked, with the straightforward perceptiveness of a retired teacher who had spent decades reading rooms. Wren considered the question in the same way she considered all questions, carefully, looking for the accurate answer. "Getting there," she said. Mrs. Alcott seemed to find this satisfactory. She closed her eyes. Wren stood by the bed for another moment, listening to the monitor mark the seconds in its reliable, quiet way, and then she went back to work. Outside, the winter held the city down under its gray weight. But somewhere in Prince George, Shirley Garrity knew her name, and somewhere with a 4-year-old named Elise, Fassbender had done the math on what a single decision on a bridge in Zari was still worth. Wren had 6 years of nights she couldn't give back, but she had the rest of the shift, and the letter in her pocket. And for the first time in longer than she could honestly account for, she let the monitor's quiet beeping be the only sound she was counting.